Welcome to Mr. V Teaching Math. In this session, we're going to take a look at proportions as part of our unit on ratios. What is a proportion? A proportion is a comparison of two ratios. Well, what does that look like? Well, it can look like a couple of things. I could do something like this. I could write it that way. Or I could actually take the same one and write it this way, which is hopefully familiar to you. This is very much like what we learned earlier about equivalent ratios. However, we call this whole thing, this is a proportion. Two ratios that are equal to each other. They are in proportion to each other. And it allows us, because it looks very much like equivalent fractions, to use some of the skills we learned earlier. Let me show you an example, for instance. Let's say I had this question. What goes here? Well, if I use my equivalent fractions skills, to turn 12 into 2, I'm going to have to divide it by 6. So I'm going to have to divide this by 6. 30 divided by 6, there, 5 over 2. Let me show you some other potential examples. What if I had this? 3/4 equals 9 over something. I could put a question mark here, I could put an X here, something here. Well, what did I times 3 by to turn it into 9? Well, this was times by 3, so this has to be times by 3. And now I have solved the proportion. Keep in mind, if you see a question that looks something like this one, for instance, that you could rewrite it like this, to try and solve it. How in the world does 2 turn into 7? Well, I'm going to have to times it by 3.5, which means I have to times this by 3.5. This will actually come out to 14. Now let me show you another example. I'm going to use one of the word problems from the assignment book that we work with in our classroom. I'm going to use number 9. At the corn roast, 3 cobs were cooked for every 7 persons. If there were 144 cobs cooked, how many people were at the roast? Of course, there's an assumption here. They're assuming that every single person was guaranteed to actually eat 3, but let's ignore that part and focus on the ratio. So, we have 3 cobs for every 7 people. This is equal to, we have 144. Now, sometimes people get confused. Where do I put what thing? How do I know? Well, you have to make sure that this is the cobs, and this is the cobs, and this is the people. And they have to be in the same position. Remember that order matters when you're dealing with ratios. Okay, so how many people were actually there? Some of you might be able to figure this out in your head. How in the world does 144 become 3, or how does 3 become 144? Like, how do I do that? Some of you can solve that in your head, but you could also do this. 3 times something equals 144. 3 times y, let's call it, equals 144. So I'm just going to go off to the side for a moment, and I'm going to do a little bit of algebra. 3 times y equals 144. How do I get y by itself? 3y divided by 3. Whatever I do to one side, I must do to the other. So what in the world is 144 divided by 3? That's 48. So I now know that I have to times this by 48, because this was times by 48. So I simply times that. And I know that there were 336 people at this corn cob roast. If you can't do this in your head, and some of you can, you could use algebra by simply taking this and solving an algebra question to find out what goes there. There are other shorter methods than this, but this is one way that can help you if you're really stuck with what in the world to do.